Welcome back to the Present History podcast and our Hitler's Kingdom Come multimedia project. This is actually the second part of our fascinating conversation with Amanda Hale, author of Mad Hatter and the daughter of James Larratt Battersby, one of the founding members of the League of Christian Reformers. So, if you haven't already, go back and listen to part one so you can kind of know what's going on. But if you have already, sit back and enjoy. So, in writing this book, you decided to write it as fiction, as a novel. What was it that drew you to write it in this style instead of, say, a non-fiction book or even a memoir?
Okay, yeah, well, that started with my research because way back in 1983, I went to England for the summer. It was when I was living in Toronto with the firm intention of interviewing as many members of my family as would do it about my father, because it's been a long time brewing, this story. And what I learned from that was that I learned a lot more about each of the people I was talking to than about my father, because everyone had quite a different story to tell about him. For my mother, she found great difficulty talking about him because it was very painful to her emotionally. My siblings all had different versions of him. My eldest sister, Sally, was, I think she knew him the best because she's 9 years older than me. And so she was very much attached to him. In fact, she's been unable actually to read Mad Hatter for reasons that she won't talk about, but I think it's just too emotionally triggering for her. And I talked to my brother Jim, and what he said, interestingly, he said, well, our father was the only safe person in the house. Which gave me, he said he was very safe, he was kind, safe, steady, didn't flare up like our mother did. Our mother was a very volatile woman emotionally. And so he was very safe, but he was ineffectual, was what Jim said. And then other aunts and second cousins and all sorts of people I talked to, some of them said, oh, he was a wonderful man. He was such a gentleman and he was such a socialite and we all loved him. And many people told me about kind things that he did for them. So I got a whole spectrum of things, but, nothing really that would say who my father was. I think it was somewhat time dependent. Before the war, he was seen in one way. When he was interned, he was seen in quite a different way. So I from that time on, I'd been making notes. I had a file. I didn't even have a computer till 1996. But once I did, I had a file, that I'd intermittently write notes and thoughts and dreams and things. I've had dreams about him. And it got to the point where, there was about 100 pages in this file. And then I started to write in a pub in England in year 2000. I was sitting in this pub with a glass of wine, a fountain pen, my notebook, and I wrote the first words of what came to be this book, Mad Hatter, which has been through many, many drafts since then, because it wasn't until 2019 that I actually published it. But I decided not then when I was writing in that pub about it, but some years into it, I was I was not really decided on the genre, but I was thinking of something like a biography. But obviously, I didn't have enough actual details. I mean, a biography or a memoir, to be particularly a biography, you have to be absolutely academically correct and footnotes and so on. I knew I didn't have that kind of information about this enigmatic person. And then I thought, well, a memoir, but it's, it wasn't supposed to be about me. It was supposed to be about him. So at a certain point, I don't remember when it was, but yeah, it was about 2012. It was 2012 already, and I decided this is going to be a novel because I am a novelist, and that gives me a lot more freedom, to imagine things and take something I've been told that sparked my imagination and just run with it. So that was my process in coming to that decision. And once I decided that, then in the summer of 2012, I wrote the half half of the book in first draft. And I think the next summer, because I'm doing many other things and jobs in between, I wrote the second half of it. And then from then, I don't know how many drafts I did, probably about 20. But that's where I came to that decision. And it was a good one because, as it turns out, I am mostly appreciated for my creative nonfiction. But I just called it a novel based on family story. Yeah, but it could have other tags to it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and so in writing this as fiction, how did you go about balancing the fact with the fiction? Because like you mentioned earlier, you did plenty of research for this book. So how did you go about using that research to create this fictionalized world in which real people lived?
Well, I think just by instinct and intuition, because I was so immersed in this for so many years, that it was just all there for me. And I was, just living, breathing, dreaming it. Um, so I didn't do any sort of analytical, this is fact and this is that. Of course, I had lots of notes with dates. And I think probably the biggest thing for me was getting the war straight, because it's not really about the war, but the war is the background. So I had to understand a lot better than I did at the time about the war. I'd always wanted to know more about the war, and it was just a foggy confusion to me. So, dates about the war. And then I have a friend, the historian I mentioned, Steve Paulson, who came to Petworth House with us, Kingdom House. And he was my history expert. That novelists have to have a lot of people that help them with various specialized areas of the book. So he was my history consultant and put me straight on a lot of the wartime background, and how you bleed that into it, because in retrospect, as you know, it's quite different. At the time, people know very little, especially back then. I mean, now we hear every day, every hour about Ukraine, and who knows what's true there. But this was a time when people, they just had the newspaper that came out later, so they were getting their news weeks, sometimes months later, of what actually was happening. So I had to take all these complexities into account. But as far as the actual story and the flow of it, that mostly went quite easily, especially with my narrator for the first third of the book, Mary Byrne, this Irish narrator, because she, like, sometimes there's a gift to a writer of a character that just walks in and takes over, and that's what Mary Byrne did. And she ends up representing for me all the women, who served in this sort of upper middle class enclave of all the families, my grandparents and my mother and so on. They all had, cleaning ladies and housekeepers. We even had, my mother had nannies for the children, before my father kind of went off and gave all the money to everybody else. And they had even a governess for her two older children, because she didn't want them going to school and, getting bullied and teased because there was all this bad press about my father. So Mary Byrne is like a catch-all for all those women that I dedicate the book to, that keep the houses running, keep the meals on the table. The people that were kind to me when I was a child, they were the ones that I would go to for comfort. Often they weren't there very long because they, quick turnover of servants. Anyway, Mary Byrne just kind of walked in, Irish woman, a girl, and she, I think she was about 20, 21, and just more or less dictated to me, because she just had this ready-made personality, which I felt like I was channeling. So she became a mouthpiece for a lot of the information, and just the writing came so easily when it was her. But that, of course, as you know, there's many characters in the book. So yeah, I had so many papers by my side. I'd be constantly referencing all these dates and this and that, and so it was that kind of process. It was like a weaving or a knitting of the facts with my imagination and with something that I thought about, and I didn't really know if someone had told me that or I'd dreamed it or what. It's a really quite an amazing process to when you're writing. You have to be doing it to kind of understand that process, and then you just have to trust it and trust the voice. And I'm quite experienced. If I tried to do this as my first novel, I think it would have been much more difficult, but I'm an experienced writer, and I've had plenty of help along the way from so many people. And then, of course, I had readers typically on a second draft. I put it out to various readers. Of course, I had an Irish woman that was, had to have somebody Irish to check out that this was correct. Although I did discover also in the process of this book, not only the four half siblings, but I discovered that we have Irish background.
Oh, wow.
Which I never knew.
Yeah.
It was my father's sister that actually confirmed that for me. So yes, just many threads, and it's a hard experience to explain because I think you have to experience it. Yeah. Everybody should try and write about their families and see what comes out.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And something that you touched on there, and something that you've written about on your blog actually, is that in the process of writing this novel, the research actually became more than just book research for you. It actually became a kind of quest for identity and family. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that and that process?
Yes. In fact, Zach, I think that what started me on the whole process was this quest for to know who my father was, and something to do with identity, because I've suffered depression a lot in my life, which I think is a normal thing. I think depression then usually ends up in some breakthrough. I mean, now people get medicated and it's called mental illness, but growing up in the aftermath of the war in a very dreary place, with a taboo person in the family who's not there but is like so present because they're taboo, all of that, it does lead to some emotional complexities, I'll call it, instead of calling it depression. But a lot of it was became a desperate desire to know who my father was, and the truth of him, rather than all these different family stories, like which one to believe. I didn't want to just take one and believe it. I wanted to know for myself, because I'm a stickler for the truth and justice and, that kind of a sensibility. So the novel was a quest for me to get to the truth of who my father was. But in fact, as that, it fails because my father remains an enigma. I've always had this sense of him as this shadowy person, and a lot of facts about him, a lot of scenes I've written for him, but still, I don't know who he was. So it failed in that way. But I'll tell you what it did was, well, first of all, it became more my mother's novel because I had to walk in my mother's shoes, and like many mother-daughter relationships, it was a difficult one. She was a difficult woman, although we did resolve it. But I began to truly understand the depth of her suffering, and came to the conclusion, which may be a romantic one, but I don't think so, that she never stopped loving him. That the man who came out of internment was not the man that went in, like men that come back from the war never will speak about it. You heard that story so many times. Different person came home. So that she lost him when that detective took him to jail. But what it's done for me is not just the writing of the book, but the publishing of it, because that's a big step. You're very vulnerable when you put something out there, and particularly with a book like Mad Hatter. I had no idea how people would receive it, but it's been received with such compassion and understanding, and people just love the book, and I've had fabulous reviews across the board. So that for me has changed my life, because this was the cloud that I sort of hid under all my life, was this feeling. As a child, we had a feeling about shame and humiliation, but we had no idea what it was. But it gets into you, and it threads right through you. So, I've had a very sort of under the radar life, although I've managed to do a lot of things in spite of it. But this has completely liberated me, the reception by the public of this book. And I think it was the right timing. I could have written it earlier, but I think at this time it's very appropriate politically, and people can receive it, because people can write books, and they're not appreciated till 30, 40 years later. So it all worked out well for me. But I have to say, it was a very emotional process too. There was a lot of tears shed at the computer during the process, along with, all the nitty-gritty rational details. So I'm grateful. I'm very grateful to people for, like people like yourself. You just contact me out of the blue because you found my webpage and were interested to read the book. That's just magic for me.
Absolutely. I can imagine. I can imagine. And I just have to say that reading this book, I thoroughly enjoyed it, but it also became really valuable in my own academic research as well, because you probably understand this as well, but as you're doing academic research, there's only so far that can take you. There does come a point where you need some sort of personal engagement with the people that you're studying or the people that you're writing about. And your book actually became a really valuable tool to understand what these people were like, their personalities and their characters, and kind of understand them to a greater level by engaging with them in a way that wasn't just purely academic anymore. They kind of came alive. So the whole experience of researching them, because of reading your book, it kind of became more than just an academic experience as well.
Thank you, Zach. That's wonderful to hear. I'm very glad that it's been helpful to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. So as a kind of final question, a bit more of a light-hearted one, depending on how you choose to interpret it, what's one thing that you would tell your younger self, or you at the beginning of this writing process for this book? What's one thing that you would tell yourself back then that you've now learned having written the book?
Oh, you mean when I just started out writing the book?
Yeah.
That's difficult for me to answer. What would I have told myself? I guess I just would have told myself, what I did really was to take my time, not be in a hurry, let it unfold in its own time, and to keep a very open mind, especially about people offering words of encouragement, help, oh, why don't you do this? Why don't you try that? I have to say that, because usually I'm very much like, this is my agenda and this is what I'm going to do. But yeah, remaining very open to every suggestion, and anything, even if it sounds crazy, because, you can go down some interesting rabbit holes. Yeah, I think I think the process of it went quite well. And I have tended, now I've reached an age where I can be more patient, but I used to be very impatient and always in a hurry when I was younger.
Right.
And I think that probably that was a part of it. I probably really wanted to get the book out and get it done, but it did take a long time. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that's valuable advice for anyone that wants to write about their own family or wants to write a book in general, really, that not to be afraid of the process, because sometimes the process will take longer than expected or shorter than expected, but not to be afraid of that process and to let it unfold as it will.
Yes, indeed. And so many people I think are, people who are not writers, they're fascinated by, oh, you're a writer, and
Yeah.
everybody wants to help. I found that people are very generous with their help or offering any kind of expertise that
Mm.
they have or knowledge. So, the more people, like sometimes, with a book, I'll be very private about it, not to get other people's influences. But with Mad Hatter, everybody knew about it. Everybody
Yeah.
knew somewhat about my story. So people were very free in offering anything that they could, about the war or, about the politics of the day or whatever, or recommending books. Particularly my cousin Kenneth, he was wonderful. He's the son of my father's sister,
Right.
and Ken, he put all these books in my path, which were enormously helpful,
Wow.
by these like Graham Macklin and, um, what is it? I can't remember the titles of them all now, but they're all listed at the back of Mad Hatter. And then I encountered Ian Cobain. He's a marvelous writer. He used to work for the Independent. Um,
Right.
no, the
Right.
Guardian,
Right.
I
Right. Right.
think. And then he's with the Middle Eastern Eye. He's a fantastic writer, journalist. He wrote Cruel Britannia: A Secret History of Torture in Britain by the British. Marvelous book. And he's done another one about the Official Secrets Act, which gives such an insight into the British, sort of the core of the British mentality and
Yeah.
all that secrecy and politeness and facade. And he's done one about Ireland and the Troubles. And I met with him, like I went to England and he met with me, and we
Wow.
had coffee and talked for a couple of hours. People like that, just so generous with
Mm.
their time. So, but all of that has been enormously helpful. A book is, it's got one person on the title who wrote it, but there's so many people. That's why you get these long lists of acknowledgements, the generosity of the common people.
100%. 100%.
Mm.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure and an honor to have you here. It's been great to chat to you. So thank you very much.
And many thanks to you, Zach. It's been wonderful, and I hope we continue to correspond.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Present History Podcast, and episode 6 of our Hitler's Kingdom Come multimedia project. If you want to find out more about the project and potentially head back through the back catalogue of what we've already spoken about, you can head to our website at presenthistory.co.uk, where you can find a webpage with all the podcast episodes, all the videos, and complete transcripts with all the citations and references, so you can know where we got our information from. And if you want to check out Amanda Hale and her work, you can head to her website at amandahale.com, and you can follow her on Twitter and Instagram as well. All the links will be in the description and the show notes as well, so never fear. Thank you again for listening to this episode of the Present History Podcast, and we'll see you in the next one.